It was the 14th of October, specifically a Tuesday, when the digital heartbeat of Oakhaven County simply ceased to exist. The morning air was unusually heavy for that time of year, thick with the metallic scent of damp earth and the undeniable, suffocating promise of a massive storm brewing just over the western ridge. Local meteorologists had been sounding the alarm for nearly a week. A slow-moving, torrential weather front was marching relentlessly toward the valley, carrying enough rain, wind, and hail to flatten any standing crop and turn the rich topsoil into an impassable sea of freezing mud. In exactly 48 hours, the harvest window would slam shut for the winter. For the farmers of Oakhaven, this was the single most critical juncture of the year. Millions of dollars of grain sat out in those fields, representing the culmination of 12 months of back-breaking sweat, crippling bank loans, and silent prayers. By sunrise on a day like this, the entire valley should have been echoing with the unified, thunderous roar of heavy diesel engines tearing through the corn and wheat. But on this specific morning, there was only a terrifying, dead silence. 52 brand new, top-of-the-line combine harvesters sat scattered across the county, entirely paralyzed. They were absolute engineering marvels, painted in gleaming, aggressive corporate colors, boasting climate-controlled cabins, heated leather seats, automated PS steering, and individual price tags, comfortably approaching $900,000. But overnight, a mandatory, over-the-air firmware update pushed through the cellular networks by the OmniAg Corporation had encountered a critical server-side error. The corrupted data packet infiltrated the main execution protocols of every single machine. When the farmers climbed into their cabs before dawn, the high-definition touchscreens displayed nothing but a single, glowing red error code. The central computers locked down the ignition systems to prevent mechanical damage. The machines refused to crank. They refused to steer. They were completely and totally bricked. 52 mechanical titans rendered nothing more than incredibly expensive lawn ornaments by a few lines of bad code, and the storm was coming. But this story wasn't really about a computer glitch. To truly understand the weight of this morning and the profound justice of the events that were about to unfold, we have to rewind exactly 3 weeks. We have to go back to the Oakhaven local diner on a morning when the sun was shining and the arrogance of modern men was on full display. It was a busy Tuesday morning. The diner was packed wall to wall, with local farmers drinking bitter black coffee, wiping grease off their hands, and complaining bitterly about the rising prices of nitrogen fertilizer. Sitting right in the center booth, taking up as much space as physically possible, was Vance Sterling. Vance was the regional distributor for OmniAg equipment. He was the kind of man who wore crisp, branded polo shirts and perfectly polished leather boots to a dirt farm. He'd drove a pristine, lifted heavy-duty truck that had never once seen a gravel road or hauled a single bale of hay. Vance possessed an arrogance that could instantly suck the oxygen out of any room he walked into. He did not just sell machines. He sold an entire philosophy. He aggressively preached the absolute supremacy of corporate technology, of cloud-based farming, of subscription models where the farmer didn't actually own the machine they paid for, but merely rented the software license to operate it. Sitting entirely alone at the far end of the laminate counter was Elias Caldwell. Elias was the exact opposite of Vance in every conceivable way. He was a man in his late 50s, his hands permanently scarred by slipped wrenches and barbed wire, wearing a faded canvas chore jacket that had barely survived a decade of brutal Midwestern winters. Elias farmed a modest 300 acres of rolling ground that had been in his family for 4 generations. He was a remarkably quiet man. He was the kind of man who preferred listening to the sound of the wind moving through the stalks and the steady rhythm of a tuned engine, rather than engaging in the loud, empty chatter of other men. Vance was feeling particularly boastful that morning. He had just closed a massive financing deal on 3 new automated combines, and he needed a captive audience to witness his superiority. He noticed Elias quietly eating his scrambled eggs at the end of the counter. Vance decided to make an example of him. He raised his voice, projecting it so that every single person in the diner was forced to listen. He called across the room, asking Elias when he was finally going to tow that rusting pile of junk out of his barn, sell it for scrap metal, and join the 21st century like a real farmer. The entire diner went uncomfortably quiet. Every man in that room knew exactly which machine Vance was talking about. Elias drove a 1982 International Harvester. It was a boxy, incredibly loud, purely mechanical beast from a bygone era. Vance laughed loudly, a sharp, grating sound, looking around at the other farmers. Gather validation. He told Elias that his combine belonged in a museum or a junkyard. He declared that any man refusing to adapt to cloud computing was just a stubborn fool waiting to go bankrupt. He openly mocked Elias's frayed clothes, his quiet nature, and his absolute refusal to sign his life away to finance a modern, computerized machine, Vance stated. And the room remembered this clearly, that holding on to the past was just a pathetic excuse for being too poor and too stupid to understand where the future was heading. Elias did not raise his voice. His face did not flush red with embarrassment. He calmly wiped his mouth with a cheap paper napkin, laid a crumpled $5 bill on the counter to cover his meal, looked Vance Sterling dead in the eyes, with a gaze as cold as river stones, and walked out the front door without uttering a single word. A few of the younger, heavily indebted farmers snickered into their coffee cups. They thought Elias had been humiliated. They thought he was defeated. They looked at him and saw nothing but a stubborn relic of a dying age. But there was something nobody in that diner knew. What they didn't understand would eventually change the fate of the entire county. Nobody in town knew the real reason why Elias lived the way he did, or why he clung so fiercely to that specific piece of old iron. 30 years ago, when Elias was just a young man learning the soil, his father had been diagnosed with an aggressive, unforgiving form of cancer. The medical bills had piled up fast, arriving in the mail like a suffocating avalanche of white envelopes. The insurance companies found loopholes. The hospital demanded payment to save the family land from being seized. Elias's father had been forced to systematically sell off almost every single piece of modern, valuable equipment they owned. He liquidated the tractors, the planters, the trucks, handing all the cash over to the bank to ensure that when he passed, Elias would inherit the dirt-free and clear of any liens. The only piece of heavy machinery they kept was that 1982 combine, simply because its title was entirely in their name. It was fully paid off. When his father finally succumbed to the illness, passing away in the very farmhouse Elias still lived in, the young man made a silent, unbreakable vow. To the dirt beneath his boots, he swore he would never owe a bank again. He swore he would never let a corporation hold a contract over his head, dictating how he lived or how he worked. That old, faded red machine was not just a collection of steel and belts to Elias Caldwell. It was a physical monument to his father's ultimate sacrifice. It was a daily reminder of the cost of freedom. To the rest of the world, it was an outdated embarrassment. But to Elias, it was his shield, his sword, and his declaration of absolute independence from a system designed to keep men in chains. Now, let us return to the suffocating morning of October 14th, the morning of the Great Silence. Panic was beginning to set in across the expanse of Oakhaven County, like a cold sweat. The men who had laughed along with Vance Sterling's cruel jokes 3 weeks prior were now standing at the edges of their fields, staring helplessly at their blank monitors, screaming obscenities into their cellular phones. Down on the sprawling, 2,000-acre corporate farm that Vance managed, the situation was rapidly deteriorating into absolute hysteria. Vance was standing in the mud next to his own personal fleet of 3 top-of-the-line OmniAg combines. His typically pristine clothes were soaked with nervous sweat. His face, usually flushed with unwarranted confidence, was now the color of old parchment. He was screaming into his phone with corporate headquarters, demanding an immediate override code, demanding a master technician, demanding someone fix the multi-million-dollar problem sitting uselessly in his field. But the voice on the other end of the line was painfully calm, sterile, and entirely useless. The software engineers were sitting in a climate-controlled glass building in California, thousands of miles away from the reality of the incoming weather. The cellular network handshake had failed. The mainframes were locked. The voice casually informed Vance that a patch would take a minimum of 72 hours to write, test, and deploy across the satellite network. Vance dropped his phone into the dirt. 72 hours was a death sentence for the crop. The storm was going to hit in 48. For all his immense wealth, for all his endless boasting about cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and smart farming algorithms, Vance Sterling was utterly, completely powerless. Nature does not negotiate with software engineers. A looming supercell does not care about your premium subscription tier miles away. Down in the lower, quieter section of the valley, Elias Caldwell walked slowly into his corrugated steel pole barn. The air inside the structure was cool and smelled deeply of old wheel-bearing grease, spilled diesel fuel, and dry, ancient dust. He stood silently before the 1982 International Harvester. "I need to stop here and tell you something incredibly important, something that makes everything that happened next possible." What the people of Oakhaven County saw when they looked at Elias's machine was nothing more than faded, oxidized red paint and hilariously outdated, boxy styling. They saw an antique waiting to die. But what they did not see, what no one outside of that barn had ever seen, was the decade of meticulous, obsessive, unseen engineering that Elias had poured into the machine's bones. You see, before he passed away, Elias's father had been a master mechanic for the military, specializing in heavy armored recovery vehicles. Together, during those long, quiet winters, they had stripped the old combine down to its bare metal frame. They did not just rebuild it, they fundamentally transformed it into a monster. They had carefully measured, cut, and retrofitted a massive, high-torque marine diesel engine into the chassis, an engine originally designed to push heavy tugboats against violent ocean currents. Elias had spent years machining custom, reinforced threshing internals out of hardened, military-grade steel. He had upgraded every single belt, pulley, and bearing to withstand twisting pressures the original manufacturer had never even dreamed of. It was a mechanical leviathan, hiding quietly under a weathered, unassuming shell, and most importantly, by its very design, it possessed not a single circuit board. It had no GPS module tracking its location. It had no wireless antenna searching for a cellular signal. It required a human hand to physically open the mechanical throttle, and it required calloused human hands to steer the heavy hydraulic wheel. It was a machine completely tethered to the earth, entirely immune to the invisible digital web that had just paralyzed the rest of the world. Elias climbed the metal ladder and stepped into the cramped, utilitarian cab. He reached forward and turned the heavy brass key in the ignition. There was a long, agonizingly slow whining of the heavy-duty starter motor. Then came a thick, violent puff of black smoke erupting from the vertical exhaust stack. And then the silence of the valley was shattered by a deafening, earth-shaking roar. The marine diesel fired into life with a force that rattled the tin roof of the barn. It was a beautiful, violent, purely mechanical symphony of moving iron and exploding fuel. In a county utterly silenced by a broken line of computer code, the sound of Elias Caldwell's engine echoed off the surrounding hills like a defiant war cry. He pulled back on the heavy steel lever to engage the separator. The massive internal components began clanking and humming with Rothschild. Terrifying physical power. Elias drove the machine out into the gray morning light, the deep treads of the massive front tires biting aggressively into the soft dirt. He did not rush. Elias never rushed. He set his rusted header down and waded directly into his own towering crop. The machine did not merely harvest the corn. It devoured it. It ate through the thick stalks with a relentless, terrifying efficiency. The marine diesel barely even bogged down, letting out a deep, throaty growl as it chewed through the densest patches of the field. He harvested his 300 acres with brutal precision by late afternoon. Above him, the sky was rapidly turning a bruised, ominous shade of purple. The wind was picking up, whispering through the remaining stalks, carrying the bitter chill of the incoming rain. But when Elias finished his very last row, he did not turn the steering wheel back toward his barn to seek shelter. He raised the header, shifted the heavy transmission into road gear, and drove his roaring machine out onto the paved county highway. The deep, rhythmic thrumming of the engine could be heard for miles. People stepping out onto their porches to look at the darkening sky stopped and turned their heads. Something was moving in Oakhaven. The escalation had begun, and the county was about to witness exactly what old iron could do when the new world breaks. Elias did not drive aimlessly into the gray afternoon. He pulled his massive machine off the main highway and turned down the long, gravel driveway of John Miller. John was a young farmer, heavily leveraged with the bank, who was currently sitting on his front porch with his head buried in his hands, weeping silently, while his bricked, computerized OmniAg machine sat uselessly in his front yard. Elias did not stop the loud engine to ask for permission to enter the property. He did not step out of the cab to negotiate a price or demand a percentage of the yield. He simply aligned his machine with the first row of John's corn, dropped the heavy steel header, and began to cut. Word spread through the valley faster than a brush fire in dry timber. By nightfall, the county roads were lined with pickup trucks. Men and women stood in the beds of their vehicles, braving the rapidly dropping temperatures, just to watch the old red machine moving relentlessly through the fields. Elias worked entirely through the night. The harsh, yellow glow of his halogen work lights pierced the darkness like a solitary lighthouse in a rising sea. He did not sleep. He barely even stopped to drink water from his dented thermos. When he finished one property, the neighboring farmers would literally run up to the side of his cab, point frantically to the next field in danger, and Elias would just offer a single, tight nod before throwing the physical throttle wide open again. The machine ran terrifyingly hot. The temperature gauges pegged near the red line, but the military-grade engine never faltered. It was built for exactly this kind of punishment. It was built to endure when everything else in the modern world failed. By the late afternoon of the second day, the very first heavy drops of freezing rain began to fall from the purple sky. The wind was howling now, violently bending the remaining stalks of corn toward the earth. Elias Caldwell had single-handedly saved 5 family farms. He had been cutting continuously for nearly 40 hours. He was physically exhausted, his eyes bloodshot and stinging from diesel fumes, his calloused hands cramping painfully around the heavy steering wheel. But as he pulled back onto the main highway one last time, everyone watching knew there was only one major farm left uncut in the immediate valley. It belonged to Vance Sterling. A massive, silent caravan of dozens of pickup trucks followed Elias as he drove the slow, heavy machine down the wet asphalt. They watched in absolute anticipation as he turned the massive front wheels onto Vance's sprawling corporate property. Vance was standing at the very edge of his massive field, already soaked to the bone by the beginning rain, staring blankly at 3 dead, silent, multi-million-dollar pieces of modern art. Elias brought his old, mud-caked harvester to a halt just a few feet from where Vance stood. The marine diesel idled, letting out a low, guttural thrumming that physically vibrated in the chests of the men watching from the road. The crowd of farmers stood by their trucks in the freezing rain, watching the scene unfold in breathless silence. Vance Sterling slowly looked up at the cab. The trademark arrogance, the condescending smirk, the corporate superiority. It was all completely gone from his face. It had been washed away by pure panic, by the terrifying realization of his own financial ruin, and by the sheer, undeniable reality of the machine standing before him. The man he had called a fossil, the man he had publicly humiliated in the diner for being too stupid to understand the future, was now holding the only lifeline he had left in the world. Vance walked up to the side of the massive front tire. He was forced to look up at Elias. His voice shook uncontrollably as he spoke over the sound of the idling diesel. He did not demand service. He did not boast about his wealth or his connections. He begged. He pleaded with Elias, asking if there was any way he could find it in his heart to save his crop before the ice took it all. Elias looked down at the soaked, trembling corporate man. He could have smiled. He could have reminded Vance of the harsh, cruel words spoken in front of the whole town. He could have simply shifted into gear, driven away, and let the man lose millions of dollars to the mud. It would have been incredibly easy. It would have been a poetic, satisfying vengeance. But Elias Caldwell was a farmer, and a real farmer. A man truly tied to the earth does not let good food rot in the field, no matter who happens to hold the deed to the dirt. Elias did not say a single word. He did not offer a forgiving smile or a nod of agreement. He simply reached down, engaged the massive threshing cylinder until it screamed, revved the marine diesel until a thick plume of black smoke poured into the rainy sky, and drove the roaring machine straight into Vance's field, passing mere inches away from the dead. Silent, computerized combines. He cut relentlessly until the storm finally broke in its full, devastating force. The rain came down in blinding sheets, instantly turning the ground into a thick, impassable soup. But the heavy, mechanical beast just kept pulling through the muck. Elias managed to save 70% of Vance's massive crop before the mud became too deep, even for his monstrous machine. When it was finally over, Elias drove the violently muddy, steaming combine back through the torrential rain to his own barn. He turned the key. He shut down the engine. The profound silence returned to the farm, but it was a very different kind of silence now. It was the heavy, exhausted silence of a battle definitively won. 3 days later, the great storm finally passed over the ridge. The valley was a muddy, devastated wreck, but the town's grain silos were full to bursting. The corporate software engineers finally arrived from the city in shiny rental cars. They plugged their sleek laptops into the diagnostic ports of the massive OmniAg combines, tapped a few keys, and the engines instantly purred back to life. But it was far too late. Nobody cared anymore. The grand illusion had been irreparably shattered. Vance Sterling desperately tried to go back to his usual, boasting self, but the town had fundamentally changed. Nobody looked at him the same way. In the following weeks, several farmers quietly canceled their expensive upgrade contracts. They had realized the hard way that operational efficiency is completely meaningless if you do not actually own your autonomy. Vance eventually requested a transfer out of Oakhaven County, unable to bear the quiet, knowing looks of the men he had once tried to rule with software and debt. As for Elias, he did not change a single thing about his life. He still wore his faded canvas jacket. He still drank bitter black coffee at the end of the diner counter, but when he walked into the room now, conversations would respectfully pause. Men would tip their hats and nod to him. They did not see a stubborn relic of the past anymore. They saw a master. I need to stop here at the end and tell you what this was really all about, because this story was never really about a broken computer update or a terrible autumn storm. It was about the incredibly dangerous arrogance of assuming that just because something is brand new, it is inherently superior. We live in a world that constantly tries to sell us the illusion of total control through glass screens, predictive algorithms, and empty digital promises. We are constantly told to discard the old ways, to look down on simple mechanics, to believe that a quiet man with grease on his hands is somehow less intelligent than a loud man with a spreadsheet. But when the sky turns dark, when the invisible networks fail, when the fragile, artificial world collapses under the brutal weight of reality, you do not want a password. You want torque, you want hardened steel, and you want a man who knows the profound difference between renting a lifestyle and owning his own soul. Elias Caldwell proved to an entire county that true, enduring power does not require a wireless connection. Sometimes, the most incredibly advanced thing a human being can do is hold the line, keep their mouth shut, and let their work do all the talking when the rest of the world goes terribly, terrifyingly quiet.